A man survived 5 brutal years of combat in Vietnam, wounded in hand-to-hand fighting, losing an arm and more than 30 of his comrades. But what finally broke him wasn't war. It was the silence of his homeland. One freezing winter morning in the suburbs of Minneapolis, a homeless man was found dead beneath a stone bridge. In the pocket of his tattered coat were a faded family photo and a worn military ID card that read, Staff Sergeant Mason Carter, U.S. Army Vietnam veteran. No one knew his name. No one was waiting for him to come home. But before he became a nobody, he was once a hero. Why did a veteran who once fought for his country die alone in the cold, forgotten, and discarded? And what happened between his final battle in the Vietnamese jungle and his silent death under an American bridge? This is the true story of a soldier who survived war but couldn't survive peace. Come with me as we walk the path he once walked, from the blood-soaked jungles to the sleepless, freezing nights beneath a bridge. You won't forget the name, Mason Carter. Before he was a one-armed soldier who gave everything on the battlefield, he was just a gentle boy who loved baseball and drinking tea with his mother on autumn afternoons. No one could have imagined that boy would leave home and never return the same again. South Dakota in the late 1960s was a quiet place, where time seemed to move slower than the rest of America. In a small house on the outskirts of Sioux Falls, Mason Carter grew up to the scent of fresh-cut grass, the aroma of apple pie in the oven, and the crackle of baseball games on an old radio. Mason wasn't extraordinary. He wasn't the top of his class, nor the star of any sports team. But he had something everyone admired, a warm heart and a noble spirit. Family meant everything to him. He would cancel a date just to help his mom harvest corn behind the house, or wake up at 5 a.m. to drive his father to the gas station when the truck broke down in winter. He used to joke, I'm no good at writing or math, but if someone needs protecting, I'll be the first to step up. Then the war came. Vietnam was all over the news. Television screens showed young soldiers trudging through the jungle, bombs exploding, and flag-draped coffins returning home every week. A silent fear crept into every home, including Mason's. In 1967, Mason received a sports scholarship from a small college in Oregon. His whole family celebrated, but just weeks later, the draft letter arrived. Mason folded the scholarship letter, tucked it into a drawer, and volunteered. His father protested. His mother cried. His baseball coach called to plead with him. But Mason quietly said, There are boys out there dying. If I can take one of their places, maybe someone else gets to come home. On the day he boarded the bus for training, he brought only a canvas duffel, worn-out sneakers, and a silver necklace his mother put around his neck before goodbye. Etched into it were 2 words, Be brave. Friends hugged him quickly. His mother whispered, voice trembling, Come back with your heart, even if not your hands. No one knew how painfully prophetic that would become. And just like that, the young boy from South Dakota left his peaceful town, armed with nothing but young courage, into a world he never imagined, the Vietnam War, where death needed no bullets, and even the chirp of a bird could signal a deadly trap. It wasn't the gunfire. It wasn't the bombs. What terrified American soldiers like Mason the most in Vietnam were things so small you couldn't even see them. Mason used to think bullets were the worst part of war. That was before he stepped into the jungle. The moment they landed in Chu Lai, a U.S. military base in central Vietnam, the heat and humidity wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket. The air was so thick and moldy, it was hard to breathe. Sweat never dried. Uniforms clung to their skin, causing rashes and painful blisters day and night. Just days in, symptoms started. One soldier woke up with eyes swollen shut from insect bites. Another shivered with a high fever and racing pulse. An 18-year-old recruit began hallucinating at night, mumbling, Something's crawling in my ear. Then it was Mason's turn. After a night patrol, he noticed a bite on his thigh. It seemed harmless at first, but by noon it was red, swollen, and burning. His pulse spiked. He shivered uncontrollably. Fever. It was jungle malaria, Southeast Asia's invisible killer. He was rushed to a field hospital. But hospital was generous. It was a tarp tent soaked with the smell of disinfectant, sweat, and blood. Mason remembered the doctor's eyes. Not panicked, just exhausted, like he'd seen this 100 times before. They gave him IVs, cold towels, and a drug that made him vomit for hours. The fever spiked, dropped, then spiked again. Sometimes he'd hear helicopters and think he was back at school. Other times he bolted upright, sure someone had yelled, "Catch!" For 3 days, Mason drifted between delirium and consciousness. A guard outside the tent shook his head and muttered, "Welcome to the real war, buddy. The jungle fight's dirtier than the VC." Mason wasn't alone. Nearly half the platoon caught malaria or infections that first week. Some had mites burrow into their hands. Others lost toenails to fungus. A junior officer was sent home early, anaphylactic shock from a fire ant bite. They'd been trained for guns, mines, ambushes, but no one taught them how to survive when their own bodies became battlefields. When Mason finally recovered and rejoined his unit, he wasn't the fresh recruit anymore. His gaze was heavier, eyes dark with sleeplessness. He lost weight in just 2 weeks, but the biggest change was inside, his belief. He started writing in a small notebook he carried. The jungle doesn't hate you. It ignores you, and when you're sick, weak, and crawling, that's when it takes you. The jungle didn't shoot. It didn't kill loudly. It waited. And for the first time, Mason realized war wasn't just man versus man. It was man versus nature, man versus his own limits, man versus fear. That first night back in the field, he lay in the jungle. Rain poured. The earth reeked of rot. He whispered, "I'm home, Mom, but this place isn't like anywhere I've ever known." What came next would be even worse than malaria. Bamboo traps hidden beneath dead leaves, surprise attacks in the black of night, and the screams of brothers in arms, sudden, then gone forever. Mason once thought insects were the worst nightmare, but then he discovered something far more terrifying: leaves, because sometimes stepping on the wrong leaf means you'll never walk again. After his near-fatal bout with jungle fever, Mason returned to his unit, an infantry platoon stationed in the mountainous jungles near the Laotian border. Soldiers used to joke that the enemy didn't need to hide because the entire jungle was already on their side. It's hard to explain the atmosphere if you've never felt it. The trees were packed so densely they formed living walls. Sunlight barely broke through the thick canopy. Every step came with the crunch of rotting leaves, the snap of twigs, the skittering of something crawling below, and always that feeling someone was watching. On his first day back on patrol, Mason walked behind a young soldier named Givens, just 20 years old. They were crossing a narrow jungle path when Givens stumbled on something small, a rusted Coca-Cola can. Then came the click, an explosion. Shrapnel tore through the air, small but enough to rip apart Givens' lower abdomen. He didn't scream, just widened his eyes and dropped, dead instantly. Mason still remembered the smell of hot blood, the desperate cries for a medic echoing uselessly through the trees. And from that moment on, he understood. The real threat wasn't the enemy with a gun. It was what you couldn't see, the silent, the waiting. No patrol was ever safe. One day, they discovered a punji trap, a simple pit hidden with branches and leaves. A soldier stepped on it, fell in, and bamboo spikes stabbed clean through his thigh. When they pulled him out, they had to cover his mouth to stop him from screaming, so they wouldn't attract more enemies. Another night, they walked through a stretch of jungle so quiet it was unnatural. No crickets, no wind, no frogs, just dead silence. The kind that tells you something is about to happen. It did. Gunfire burst from the bushes, from the trees, from behind. Mason once said, "There is no front line. There's only jungle, and any bush can explode." After every mission, fewer came back than had left. They stopped asking each other's names, stopped asking where they were from, because it hurt too much to lose someone you knew. One rainy night, Mason wrote in his journal, "We can't tell where nature ends and traps begin. The jungle has become the enemy, and we lost prey." One time, they spotted a helmet lying in the middle of the path, like someone had dropped it. But no one went near. They circled around. Later, a soldier said that helmet was a greeting, but if you stepped forward, it'd be your farewell. The jungle didn't forgive mistakes. Mason, once a smiling, easygoing boy, now always squinted, always kept his finger on the trigger, as if he no longer trusted anything, not even the ground beneath his feet. What comes next was the most brutal battle of Mason's life, a hand-to-hand nightmare in the dead of night, where he would lose his left arm, and only 4 of the 40 men would survive 4 days of hell. 40 American soldiers marched into the jungle near the Laotian border on a short mission. When the rescue chopper landed 4 days later, only 4 could still walk on their own. In April 1972, as the Vietnam War entered its bloodiest final months, Mason's platoon was ordered into a dense forest near the border. Intel suggested local guerrilla forces were active there. No one knew exactly what waited. The order was simple: search and secure the area. They entered the jungle at 7 a.m., armed with rifles, ammunition, rations for 3 days, and the belief that they'd come back. But then, around 3 p.m. that afternoon, as they climbed a slope scattered with dead logs and thick underbrush, the first explosion ripped through the air. A B-40 rocket hit the front of the column. Flames, smoke, debris, blood, screams. There was no time to think. Immediately, AK fire and RPD machine guns thundered from 3 sides like a monsoon. The Americans dug for cover, holes, ditches, anything. But there was no safe spot. Mason saw Patterson, a young soldier from Iowa, hit in the throat while trying to radio for help. He collapsed, eyes wide, blood gushing from his mouth. 6 men died in the first few seconds. They fired back blindly. The enemy was shadows between trees, vanishing before you could aim. As night fell, the survivors pulled back into an old bomb crater. They dug trenches, stacked backpacks and broken rifles for cover, and even used the bodies of fallen friends. Mason took a deep cut to his left arm while dragging a wounded man out of the line of fire. He tied it off and tried to ignore the pain, focused on calming younger soldiers. That first night, 11 were killed. 7 more were wounded. The radio was dead. They were completely cut off. The next morning, any hope that the enemy had left was shattered. Another ambush hit right after breakfast. This time it was claymore mines, flares, and improvised mortars. One blast hit just 30 feet from Mason, throwing him into a trench. His shoulder shattered, his left arm went numb, blood soaked through his shirt. He thought he was dying. But what broke him wasn't the injury, it was the screaming. Tucker, the squad leader, took shrapnel to the gut, intestines spilling out. Mason held him for 15 minutes until he died. Another soldier, young, ran to help and stepped on a mine. He was thrown like straw, fell like meat. No one dared approach. Rain came that afternoon, washing away the blood, but not the memories. Less than 20 men remained. Many were wounded. Mason, his left arm useless, still tried to reassure others. Just survive today. We'll go home. But no one believed it anymore. Day 3 began with eerie silence. No gunshots, no mortar fire, no movement. And that was the most terrifying sound of all. Givens, the 19-year-old rookie, whispered, "Why is it so quiet?" Mason didn't answer. He knew that's how war breathes, right before it strikes. At exactly 10 a.m., they came from behind. No gunfire, only knives, axes, primitive weapons, a close-quarter ambush, face to face. Mason took a blade deep into his left shoulder, tendon severed. The arm was useless. He fell back, firing his Colt .45 blindly. He wasn't fighting to survive. He was fighting not to die easy. They pushed the enemy back but lost 10 more men. Now only 9 remained. Their faces were hollow, eyes red from smoke, blood, and shock. Mason no longer had an arm, but he still had a voice, and he used it to keep them sane. On the morning of the 4th day, they heard something. A helicopter. For the first time in days. Mason crawled into the clearing, one good arm shaking, and lit the signal flare. Soon, a single Huey descended, bullets still popping in the distance. Only 4 men could walk aboard. The rest were either carried on stretchers or left behind, unrecognizable. As the chopper lifted off, Mason looked down at the jungle one last time. It wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a nameless graveyard, where the souls of 36 brothers would stay forever. A young soldier asked, "Why are we the ones who lived?" Mason replied, not sure if he was talking to anyone at all, "To tell the story." Mason survived the hell of the jungle, but he didn't know the real nightmare would begin the moment he stepped back on American soil. The helicopter brought Mason and the 3 remaining soldiers back to a field hospital in Da Nang. then to the Philippines, and finally back to the U.S. When the plane landed at Fort Hood, Texas, there were no cheers, no parades, no waving flags, just the tired footsteps of worn-out soldiers and stacks of cold, bureaucratic paperwork, as if nothing had ever happened. Mason spent 2 months in a military hospital recovering from his wounds. His left arm, badly infected, had to be amputated entirely from the shoulder. He learned to use his right hand for everything, brushing his teeth, writing, buttoning a shirt, and he stopped being surprised when he woke up drenched in sweat from the same nightmare. He didn't talk much in the hospital, didn't speak about the battle, didn't mention Gibbons, Tucker, Young, or Patterson. Every name was a knife cutting into his memory. He just stared out the window, watching a bare tree branch sway in the wind, as if waiting for someone to return. PTSD, the war within. After being discharged, Mason received the Purple Heart and an honorable discharge. He returned home to South Dakota, back to the small town filled with memories of childhood. But it no longer felt like home. And Mason was no longer the son his parents remembered. His father had aged drastically. His mother tried to cook his favorite meals, but Mason couldn't eat. The smell of grilled meat reminded him of burning flesh and gunpowder in the jungles of Quang Tri. He couldn't sleep, and when he did, he dreamed of his fallen comrades. He would wake up clutching his pillow like it was a rifle. One night, his mother gently entered his room and whispered, "Mason, are you okay?" He spun around and shouted, "They're coming! Get down!" After that, he moved out and lived alone. Industrial. A broken family, a turned-back society. He married a hometown girl, Susan, who had waited for him during the war. They had a son, Joshua, but Mason's pain never rested. He grew irritable, withdrawn. The sound of the vacuum cleaner made him hurl his coffee mug. The smell of gasoline made him gag. When Joshua dropped a stack of books, Mason dove under the table by reflex. Susan cried many nights. She didn't understand, and Mason couldn't explain. 3 years later, she left, taking Joshua with her. From veteran to invisible man, Mason tried to work. He got a job at a small mechanic shop, learning to manage tools with one arm, using clamps, elbows, even his teeth. But the nightmares haunted him. One day, a minor air compressor leak caused a small explosion. Mason collapsed, shaking violently. Though the shop owner sympathized, he had to let Mason go. After that, no one would hire him. A one-armed man with signs of mental trauma who could suddenly scream in a crowded store? No thanks. Eventually, his savings dried up. He couldn't pay rent. Mason began to drift. Once a soldier trained for war and survival, Mason now had to survive in a country where no one shot at him, but no one saw him either. The beginning of the invisible journey. Mason ended up in Minneapolis, a city he once passed through during his service. There he found a concrete bridge near Riverside Park, and on one freezing December night, that bridge became his home. Each day he left the underpass at 6 a.m. and sat on a park bench. He never begged, just sat. If someone gave him food, he accepted it. If someone asked his name, he replied, "Staff Sergeant Carter, retired." Some people took pity, bringing him black coffee, bread, old coats. But no one knew the story behind the deep eyes of that old man who sat quietly each morning. The man who once held a rifle, buried his friends, and carried an unseen war inside him. Mason Carter didn't choose homelessness, but he chose silence. When the world had no place for a soldier who had lost his arm, his family, and himself. Under Riverside Bridge, he created a space of his own. A few cardboard sheets, a torn blanket, and an old backpack that held everything he had left in life. He didn't ask for money, only peace. Every morning, he walked to the same wooden bench across from the lake. In summer, he listened to ducks. In winter, he watched the lake freeze white. Locals began recognizing him. An elderly woman brought black coffee every Monday. A retired librarian gave him books. A young boy left him sandwiches wrapped in napkins. He never begged, never pleaded, just smiled and said, "Appreciate it. That's more kindness than I deserve." And when someone asked once, a curious student asked, "Sir, why are you living under a bridge?" Mason looked at him for a moment, no anger, just weariness, and gently said, "Some bridges you cross, some you crawl under when no one's waiting on the other side. It wasn't bitterness, just his way of saying he had nowhere else to go and no one waiting. Still a soldier, just in the shadows. He carried himself like a veteran, sitting straight, clothes tidy, shoes always clean, even if they were falling apart. In his backpack were three things he never parted with: a neatly folded American flag, a thin notebook, a black and white photo from the 70s showing him holding his wife and son. Sometimes he would pull out the flag and rest it on his lap for hours, like he was guarding something sacred that only he understood. Someone once mocked him. "What's there to be proud of, old man?" He smiled sadly and replied, "I'm not proud of where I live. I'm proud I'm still standing." Nights, where the memories return. Every night under the bridge was a new battle. The rumble of cars, the howl of wind through concrete cracks, the metal clatter from nearby dumpsters, all combined into a haunting melody of his war. Some nights he screamed. Some nights he whispered the names of fallen friends. Some nights he just stared into the dark. A social worker once offered him a spot in a veterans shelter. He declined. "No need. The war already gave me a roof. It just happened to be a bridge." A silent sentinel of the bridge. Locals called him the Bridge Watcher. No one knew he had a Purple Heart. No one knew he'd survived a battle where 36 men died. No one knew he still wrote in his notebook, one line a day, one memory per night. No newspaper ever reported it. No alarms rang. No funeral music played. But when his true identity was discovered, the entire community bowed their heads, because his name was part of a history they had forgotten. Winter 1994, Minneapolis. Temperatures dropped to 17 degrees Celsius. Some families huddled near fireplaces, sipping hot cocoa, listening to weather updates on the radio. But under Riverside Bridge, Mason Carter curled up beneath his worn blanket, hugging his pack like it might leave him too. Back against the concrete pillar, he stared into the dark, a dark that once was the jungle of Vietnam. He left no final words, didn't call out, didn't ask for help, just him, and one final message scribbled on a cardboard scrap beside his tattered boots: "If no one remembers me, I still remember all of them." The next morning, as usual, Mrs. Jean, the elderly woman who brought him coffee, came to his spot, but he wasn't on the bench. She walked under the bridge, called out, no answer. She stepped closer, and her heart froze. Mason was still sitting upright, back straight, head tilted gently, eyes closed, as if he was just resting. But his body was cold. The coffee cup in her hand trembled, dripping onto the frozen concrete. Police were called. Inside his backpack, they found a black and white photo of his family, a folded American flag, a notebook, final page reading, "Tell them I didn't quit, I just finished my watch." Days later, thanks to a worn veteran ID, his identity was confirmed. Staff Sergeant Mason D. Carter, U.S. Army, 1967 to 1972, Vietnam War veteran, Purple Heart recipient. The news spread quickly. People couldn't believe the quiet old man they passed in the park each morning was a war hero who'd survived a battle that took 36 American lives. A group of veterans in Minneapolis organized a simple but solemn memorial. No big church, no famous priest, just a park, a folded flag, and a heavy silence. The farewell. It rained lightly that day. In the park where he once sat, they placed a single photo of Mason, thin face, distant eyes, soft smile. About 30 people came. Half were veterans in uniform. The other half were the strangers who once gave him coffee, bread, or a respectful nod. A veteran placed his hand on the flag and said, "He didn't die homeless. He died in all our hearts, the ones who never knew his name until now." A young soldier, maybe 22, stood at attention, saluted, and whispered with a trembling voice, "Rest easy, Sergeant. We see you now." After the memorial, locals proposed placing a small plaque beneath the bridge where Mason once lived. Nothing grand, nothing flashy, just a simple bronze plate engraved with the words, "In memory of Soc Mason D. Carter, a soldier who never stopped serving, even in silence." And from that day on, the bridge was known by a different name, Carter Bridge. No one saw him off while he was alive. But after he passed, an entire community stood up, not because he was famous, but because he became a living reminder of something America is slowly forgetting. We may win wars, but we lose if we let our soldiers die alone. Mason Carter's story is not a rare tragedy. It's a mirror held up to a painful truth hiding in plain sight across America. According to the latest data from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, over 37,000 veterans in the U.S. are homeless, men and women who once wore the uniform, held a weapon for a cause, and traded their youth for one word: service. Many of them didn't die in combat. They died from depression, cold, poverty, and neglect. Each year on Veterans Day, we wave flags, hold ceremonies, give speeches about sacrifice. But what about the other 364 days? What about winter mornings like the one when Mason passed? There was no ceremony for him while he was alive, no health care card for PTSD, no veteran outreach officer came looking, no letter ever arrived. For Mason, the real war began when he came home. When a soldier is pulled away from his brothers, removed from a place where pain was shared and understood, he's dropped into a society that neither understands nor wants to understand what he's endured. Most Americans have never felt what it's like to sleep in a jungle where every branch could kill you, or to carry the face of a dead friend through your dreams for 40 years, or to lose everything and then be called a bum. Not because he was a hero, not because he fought, but because he reminds us of this hard truth. If we forget those who sacrificed, we don't deserve the peace they gave us. Mason's story forces us to ask, how many veterans are sleeping outside right now? How many are still fighting invisible wounds? And when, if ever, does the war truly end for a soldier? We can wave flags, we can build monuments, we can give medals, but none of that matters if a soldier cannot live with dignity after the uniform is gone. That's why the best way to honor veterans isn't just to say thank you. It's to ensure no more soldiers die in silence. No more bridges become graves. No next generation is asked to fight a war we didn't learn from. Peace doesn't start at a negotiation table. It starts with how we treat those who gave everything to bring it home. If you've watched this video to the very end, you've seen a truth that many choose to ignore. Share Mason Carter's story. Don't let his name live only in this video. Let it live in every small action, a nod to a homeless man, a kind word to an aging veteran in the park, or a moment of hesitation before cheering for another war.